past, the primary role of SAC's tanker force was to provide aerial refueling for various types of receiver aircraft, from the Strategic Air Command, Military Airlift Command, and the Tactical Air Command. However, memorandums of agreement with other departmental agencies have given this role a new look. Today's tanker force has the additional requirement of providing refueling support for Navy and Marine Corps attack, fighter, and reconnaissance aircraft. This program is designed to provide familiarization training for receiver pilots during probe and drogue refueling operations with Air Force tanker aircraft. During the presentation, we will look at communications, receiver techniques, emergency procedures, and systems malfunctions. Let's look at communications and basic procedures you will be using. One aspect where Navy and Air Force in-flight refueling procedures differ significantly is in terminology and communications procedures. While the Navy routinely carries out the tanking evolution with no radio communications whatsoever, under normal circumstances, certain radio calls are required by the Air Force. These mandatory calls will be discussed here. It should be noted, however, that provisions exist for minimum communications refueling under combat and training evolutions. The visual signals to be employed in such cases are contained in the Air Force -3 and NATOP's Air Refueling Manual. Minimum communications refueling may be requested by the receiver flight leader or specified beforehand in the brief or operations message. If minimum communications procedures are used, the 1/2 mile radio call is still mandatory, which will be discussed later. The initial communication between receiver and tanker aircraft should occur a minimum of 15 minutes prior to the ARCT. The receiver flight leader should contact the tanker with the following information: call sign, number and type of aircraft, position and altitude, and verify that armament systems are safe. Air Force terminology for switches safe is nose is cold. However, radar need not be secured until the observation position is reached.
Reach 1-2, this is Thunder 5-1 in flight 3A7s 50 miles east of the ARCP, flight level 240, nose is cold.
Roger, Thunder 5-1. 1-2 copies all. Check altimeter 29902.
Tanker lead will also provide the air refueling base altitude, rendezvous and refueling heading, turn range, and offset and offload. The rendezvous may be affected by GCI or airborne radar, air-to-air TACAN, ADF, or other means. During the rendezvous, the receiver aircraft shall remain 1,000 feet below the tanker aircraft's altitude. Once the tanker is sighted, the receiver flight lead will report visual contact established and climbing to the refueling altitude.
Thunder Flight Tally Ho, we're on your 6 o'clock 5 miles, leaving 240 for 250.
When the receivers reach 1/2 nautical mile in trail, the boom operator assumes control of communications on the tanker aircraft. He or she will establish positive communications with a simple radio check, which must be acknowledged by all receiver aircraft.
Thunder Flight, this is Reach 1-2 boom operator, radio check.
Thunder 5-1, land clear. 2, 3.
At this time, the lead aircraft will normally proceed to the pre-contact position. Number 2 will proceed to the observation position with the remainder of the flight. The refueling sequence will be determined by the receiver flight lead. When stabilized in pre-contact, a position where the probe is approximately 5 feet directly aft of the drogue basket, the receiver pilot will advise the boom operator.
5-1, stabilized.
5-1, you're cleared to the contact position. 1-2 is ready.
When the probe and drogue basket are engaged, the receiver pilot reports contact, which is acknowledged by the boom operator.
5-1, contact. 1-2, contact.
The contact call by the receiver pilot is very important to the boom operator. Because of the limited visibility of the Drogue, it's possible for contact to be established without the boom operator's knowledge. It's also the boom operator's signal to advance the tanker's refueling system to the contact-made configuration. The boom operator's acknowledgement is equally important. This call confirms that both the tanker and receiver systems are in the contact-made configuration. Now, the tanker co-pilot, who cannot observe the refueling evolution in progress, knows that the refueling pumps can be energized and fuel offloaded.
Boom, go. He's taking fuel.
Roger, call.
When disengagement occurs, the term disconnect is reported by both the receiver pilot and the boom operator. Disconnect cues the co-pilot to secure the air refueling pumps. Securing the air refueling pumps decreases the amount of fuel spray when the probe and drogue basket disengage. However, be aware that small quantities of fuel spray may be evident. If this occurs, receiver pilots may experience fuel spray on the windshield. In this situation, forward visibility is temporarily reduced, depending on the amount of fuel spray, up to 30 seconds. The fuel spray may also cause fumes in the cockpit due to engine ingestion. These fumes may be transmitted through the cockpit air conditioning and pressurization system. Fuel spray is greatly reduced on coordinated disconnects since the tanker's pumps are turned off prior to disconnect. Coordinated disconnects routinely occur when receivers have received their scheduled offload or a no-flow condition exists. In this instance, the boom operator will advise the receiver pilot.
5-1, no flow, 4.5.
5-1, roger. 5-1, disconnect.
1-2, disconnect.
Basically, the boom operator's call specified that there was no longer fuel flow and the receiver unloaded 4,500 pounds of fuel. 5-1 then drops back and moves to the observation position. At this time, the boom operator recycles the boom to relieve trapped fuel pressure. It's important to realize that the boom must be recycled after each disconnect or unsuccessful contact. When recycling is complete, the boom operator will clear the next receiver to pre-contact. However, prior to receiving clearance from the observation position, the receiver must report nose cold, switches safe.
1252, nose cold, switch is safe.
Roger, 5-2, you're cleared from observation to pre-contact.
52.
Again, the receiver must stabilize approximately 5 feet after the drogue basket and await clearance from the boom operator prior to beginning the approach. These procedures will be used by all subsequent receivers, regardless of the number of aircraft in cell. Now, let's look at techniques. Probably the most significant differences between the tanking you are accustomed to and that which you will experience behind the KC-135 involves the techniques required in the actual drogue engagement. Once the KC-135's drogue system is understood and the required technique differences anticipated, problems may be minimized or avoided. The first aspect to consider is the weight and stiffness of the basket itself. The drogue assembly weighs 120 pounds, which is significantly more than the KA-6D or buddy store assembly. The increased weight and drag of the KC-135 drogue will greatly reduce the bow wave effect usually experienced by receiver pilots during the final few feet of closure. For this reason, the receiver should stabilize approximately 5 feet aft of the basket, allow the drogue to stabilize, and select a formation reference on the tanker. Using this reference, peripheral vision will include the drogue. The drogue should not be used as a primary reference since drogue oscillation will invariably result in over-control of the aircraft. Additionally, the basket itself is rigid. Since the basket is stiffer than usual, it's much less forgiving to off-center engagements. This necessitates flying the probe all the way in as nearly on-center as possible. It is also important to maintain your altitude in relationship to the basket and establish a closure rate not to exceed 2 knots or approximately 2 to 3 feet per second. Hookups from closure rates higher than 2 knots are likely to cause the hose to whip, possibly damaging the probe, drogue, or receiver. Disregard any small oscillations of the drogue while closing for contact and make no attempt to chase the drogue in pitch. Caution: there is no hose response with this system. Receiver aircraft should exercise extreme caution during the engagement phase in order not to engage the hose at an excessive closure rate. To do so could result in a broken hose probe condition. Another significant difference you will confront with the KC-135 Drogue system is the short hose length and complete lack of reel response. The only flexible parts of the system are the ball joint, trunnion, and the hose itself, which is 9 feet in length. When engaged, if an excessively large bend or loop is present in the hose length, it will often become unstable and tend to oscillate back and forth. Caution: special precautions must be taken to prevent the hose from looping around the probe while in contact. If this occurs, stabilize in the contact position and coordinate with the boom operator on the action necessary to correct the situation. Disconnects made with the hose looped around the probe may result in damage to the receiver aircraft or the tanker drogue assembly. Should hookup result in the hose loop lying on the aircraft nose, fuel may still be transferred if the fuel requirement is critical, or a disconnect may be effected to reposition the hose. No attempt should be made to swing the hose loop from one side to the other without fully extending the hose or disconnecting. Fuel leaks and crimps in the hose are also items which must be monitored very carefully. Air refueling will be terminated when a crimp and/or fuel leak is observed in the hose, except in case of emergency or when continuance of refueling is dictated by operational necessity. This is further defined in the Air Force Refueling Manual by the following warning. Whenever the boom operator observes fuel leaking, he will immediately notify the tanker co-pilot to turn off the air refueling pumps, notify the receiver, and call for an immediate disconnect to minimize the ingestion of fuel into the receiver's engines. No further contact will be attempted with this receiver except in cases of emergency or when continuance is dictated by operational necessity. This effect will become very significant as the hose deflection exceeds 1/2 hose length. In fact, it is a standard boom operator's call to warn the pilot when he is approaching 1/2 hose length from the boom end.
5-2, you're approaching half hose.
You can see now that instead of the 20 feet of refueling range you are accustomed to, you have only 4 to 5 feet of longitudinal range. A common tendency when tanking with the KC-135 for the first time is to over-control longitudinal corrections and rapidly exceed 1/2 hose length or inadvertently disengage the basket. The relative stiffness of the basket and lack of reel response will surprise most pilots on their initial contact. Their immediate reaction will be to pull off too much power, resulting in an immediate disconnect. If the pilot is aware of these peculiarities, makes a conscious effort to keep his closure speed to a minimum, and then uses small power corrections, he will avoid any major problems with the KC-135. The boom operator will make every attempt to maintain the boom as motionless as possible. However, due to the inherent flexibility of the boom structure, some oscillation will be encountered. Because the drogue is positioned so far below the body of the KC-135 in comparison to Navy tankers, the pilot will primarily be relying on the tanker, drogue, hose, and boom itself for positioning cues. The boom operator is in a good position to observe any drift and will not hesitate to provide corrections while engaged. After air refueling is complete, disconnect should be made directly aft and level with the drogue aligned to the free trail position. To prevent excessive side forces damaging the probe or the aircraft, disconnect must be flown with the same care as hookup. Caution: the boom operator will not retract the boom to effect a disconnect except in an emergency. The drogue whips back and forth over its trail position very rapidly when breaking contact, and if the receiver is to the left or right of the prescribed trail position, the drogue could cause excessive damage to the receiver. We have basically covered normal probe and drogue refueling procedures. So let's see what happens when incorrect procedures are utilized. Next, we'll look at emergency air refueling procedures. When a crew member aboard either the tanker or receiver determines that an emergency exists, he will transmit on an air refueling frequency the tanker's call sign and the word breakaway 3 times. At this time, the tanker's lower rotating beacon will be turned on. The breakaway call is used to notify the tanker and receiver of any condition which would require an immediate vertical and horizontal separation of the aircraft. This will include, but will not be limited to, excessive rate of closure, closure overrun, and engine failure. The aircraft do not necessarily have to be in contact made to call a breakaway. The following action will be taken simultaneously by the indicated crew members.
Reach 1-2, breakaway, breakaway, breakaway.
The tanker pilot will increase power if available to obtain forward separation. When clear of the receiver, he will climb straight ahead with wings level, then direct the co-pilot to return beacon lights to both on and position lights to bright. The receiver pilot will disconnect, retard throttles, and establish a definite rate of descent, using speed brakes if necessary. If possible, dropped aft of the tanker until the entire tanker is in sight and monitor flight instruments. Note: if a breakaway is called prior to any receiver reaching the observation position, the entire receiver flight will execute the breakaway procedure. If a breakaway is called for after the receivers have reached the observation position, only the receiver in contact or pre-contact position will execute the breakaway procedure. The receivers in the observation position will maintain formation on the tanker. We'll now look at systems malfunctions. When any system malfunction or condition exists which could jeopardize safety, air refueling will not be accomplished except during fuel emergencies or when continuance of refueling is dictated by operational necessity. In addition, anytime fuel siphoning is noticed, fuel transfer will be stopped and the receiver pilot notified. The requirements to continue fuel transfer will be at the discretion of the receiver pilot. Since problems have been experienced with A4 series aircraft, the following special precautions apply. Warning: after an A4 receiver aircraft engages the drogue, the tanker pilot shall transfer a few gallons, then cease the transfer to ensure that fuel is not leaking from the drogue. If no fuel leakage is reported, continue normal transfer. If, during subsequent refueling, the A4 pilot observes fuel escaping at the coupling, he shall immediately break away. Note: a small amount of fuel spray may be present upon drogue engagement or disengagement. However, no fuel spray should be evident during fuel transfer. Air refueling operations may be continued at the receiver's discretion. That concludes the KC-135 portion of the program. So let's look at KC-10 procedures. Since the KC-10 has refueling characteristics similar to Navy tankers, we will only point out the differences. However, be aware that many of the previous KC-135 procedures also apply. First, let's look at the KC-10 hose reel aerial refueling system. The hose is 80 feet in length, with approximately 70 feet of the hose trailed. The fueling range is approximately 5 feet from full trail for 35 feet. 3 signal lights, red, amber, and green, that show the status of the reel system are located on the fuselage aft of the Drogue stowage tube. A steady red light indicates that the hydraulic pressure is too low for hose reel operation. A flashing red light, which is controlled by the boom operator, is an emergency signal for the receiver to break away from the tanker. A steady amber light indicates the hose is in full trail position and the system is ready for contact. A flashing amber light indicates the hose has been pushed in past the inner fuel flow limit. And finally, a green signal light indicates that fuel is flowing. As with the KC-135, initiation of closing to the Drogue for engagement should be from the stabilized pre-contact position. When approaching the Drogue, closure rates not exceeding 3 knots should be maintained until the probe is engaged. However, the optimum desired closure rate for the KC-10 reel system is 2 to 3 knots. Upon engaging the Drogue, the hose must be pushed in approximately 5 feet to start fuel flow. The receiver should move an additional 10 feet of hose into the fuel flow range to minimize the possibility of an inadvertent disengagement. Upon completion of refueling, the receiver should have the probe in the vertical plane of the normal hose trail position. The receiver should reduce power and back out as to keep the hose aligned with the base tunnel to cause minimal Drogue movement upon disengagement. The receiver should continue straight back after disengagement and then assume the assigned post-refueling formation position. Additional receivers will utilize the same procedures. That concludes the program. During this presentation, we looked at communications, receiver techniques, emergency procedures, and systems malfunctions. Although this program offers excellent guidance in probe and Drogue procedures, it cannot replace sound judgment and knowledge of appropriate directives. The NATOPS Air Refueling Manual clearly spells out the do's and don'ts of probe and Drogue refueling. Know the rules and abide by them, and maybe you'll hear,
Super job, Thunderflight. See you another day.